If you want to learn more about how we survived this, trust me, you'll want to subscribe. The journey is far from over. As a call to join a larger community, encourage viewers to feel part of something bigger by subscribing. The Gorn spacecraft roared through the atmosphere, a blazing trail of fire and smoke marking its path as it careened toward the surface. Inside, Cygnus gripped her seat tightly, feeling every shudder, every groan of the ship's battered frame. Her heart pounded as she braced for impact, the cacophony around her filling her senses. With a bone-rattling jolt, the ship crashed into dense jungle terrain, metal grinding against earth, debris scattering in every direction. Silence fell, broken only by the soft rustle of leaves settling and the distant calls of alien creatures hidden within the jungle. Slowly, she came to, pain flooding her senses as she opened her eyes to chaos around her. Smoke curled from ruptured systems, and the sharp tang of burnt metal filled the air. Straining, she managed to push herself up, feeling the sharp sting of torn scales and bleeding wounds. Her head throbbed, and every muscle protested as she dragged herself free from the wreckage, her gaze sweeping over the broken remains of her vessel. It lay sprawled across the jungle floor, a testament to the impact that had left it utterly mangled. Instinct took over. She moved toward the communication array, hoping against hope that the distress beacon had survived the crash. Her hands trembled as she manipulated the controls, claws scraping against the charred console. Silence. The device was dead, a victim of the wreck just like the ship. A sinking feeling grew in her chest. The slim thread of rescue had snapped, leaving her alone. Ignoring the throbbing in her limbs, she scavenged the remaining supplies, gathering a small pack of essentials, emergency rations, a water purifier, and a basic medical kit. Each step reminded her of her injuries, a steady ache that threatened to break her resolve. Gritting her teeth, she forced herself onward, refusing to succumb to the helplessness creeping in. As she stepped beyond the wreckage, the jungle loomed around her, dark and unfamiliar. Massive trees stretched skyward, their canopies blocking out the sunlight, casting everything in a perpetual twilight. Strange plants, unlike anything she'd ever seen, grew in thick clusters, their colors vibrant yet foreboding. The air was humid, thick with the earthy scent of decaying vegetation mixed with the smoke still rising from the wreck. Navigating the dense undergrowth, she moved cautiously, her senses on high alert. Every rustle, every flicker of movement, made her pause, scanning her surroundings. She was aware of the dangers hidden within this unfamiliar world. Even the smallest creature could prove lethal to an outsider. Her instincts, honed through years of training, told her that surviving here would require every ounce of her strength and cunning. Hunger gnawed at her, but the rations were limited. She ate sparingly, only enough to sustain her energy, aware that she might need every last bite. The jungle sounds filled her ears, the buzzing of unseen insects, the distant calls of creatures, the soft whisper of leaves shifting in the wind. In the vast silence, each noise seemed magnified, a constant reminder of her isolation. A few hours into her journey, she found a stream trickling through the undergrowth, its water clear yet alien. Crouching beside it, she filled her purifier, watching as the small device worked, filtering the unknown contaminants that might lurk in the seemingly pure liquid. As she drank, she caught her reflection, a face etched with exhaustion and determination. Blood from her wounds had dried on her scales, mingling with dirt and grime, giving her a hardened, almost primal look. Nightfall approached swiftly, casting a deep darkness over the jungle. The temperature dropped, and unfamiliar sounds grew louder, surrounding her. She found a spot near a large tree with roots that formed a small enclosure, a makeshift shelter against the unknown dangers lurking in the shadows. Settling down, she wrapped herself in her cloak, every muscle tensed, ears attuned to every sound. Sleep was a luxury she could scarcely afford, yet exhaustion clawed at her, dragging her into uneasy slumber. In the twilight between sleep and wakefulness, memories surfaced, of her home, her people, and the deep-seated beliefs they held about humanity. Her people viewed humans as lesser beings, creatures of impulse and violence, unworthy of true respect. And yet, stranded here, she found herself wondering, would a human even survive this jungle alone? She pushed the thought aside, focusing instead on the rhythmic rise and fall of her breathing, grounding herself. Morning brought a dull, aching light that barely pierced the thick canopy overhead. She woke to the damp chill clinging to her scales, stretching to ease the stiffness in her limbs. Her wounds had begun to heal, but the pain persisted, a constant reminder of her vulnerability in this hostile environment. Gathering her belongings, she continued through the jungle, guided only by instinct and a vague hope that moving forward might eventually lead her to safety. The hours blurred together as she trekked, her energy dwindling with each step. Fatigue weighed heavily on her, and more than once she stumbled, her vision blurring as exhaustion threatened to overtake her. She was far from civilization, lost in a sea of green with no way to send for help, no allies to rely on. The loneliness pressed down on her, growing heavier with each passing moment. Then, as she moved deeper into the jungle, she felt it, a subtle prickling at the back of her neck. A sense that she wasn't alone. She paused, scanning the trees, her gaze darting from shadow to shadow. Silence hung thickly, broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves. Yet the feeling persisted, a creeping awareness that made her instinctively wary. Her hand moved to the weapon strapped to her side, fingers tightening around it as she resumed her journey, her pace more cautious. Despite the solitude, the sense of being watched refused to leave her. It gnawed at her, a constant presence lurking just beyond her vision. She knew the jungle was home to predators, yet this felt different, intelligent, deliberate. Each step became an exercise in restraint, her senses sharpened by the awareness of this unseen observer. As she continued, she found herself talking softly, the sound of her own voice a strange comfort in the oppressive silence. The jungle had a way of pressing down, making even the smallest sound feel intrusive. And still, that silent observer shadowed her, a distant presence keeping pace with her every move. Part of her wanted to call out, to confront whatever creature might be trailing her, but pride and caution held her back. To show fear would be to invite danger, and in this hostile environment, every ounce of her strength was focused on survival. With each passing hour, her strength waned, yet she pressed on, fueled by a determination she scarcely understood. She was lost, yes, and injured, but the drive to survive burned within her, an unyielding spark in the face of her isolation. Cygnus continued through the dense jungle, her movements slow and measured as the physical strain of her injuries weighed heavily on her. Each step felt like a trial, but she forced herself forward, pushing through pain and fatigue. Her scaled skin, rough and resilient, was marred by cuts and scrapes, the vibrant colors dulled under the grime of blood and dirt. The isolation was absolute. No familiar voices, no hum of a vessel, only the rustle of leaves and the distant calls of unseen creatures filling the air. As she progressed, survival became a delicate balance between caution and necessity. She had to rest, but every pause risked exposure to threats she couldn't fully understand. In these moments, the sounds of the jungle took on an eerie quality, each shift in the undergrowth a possible danger. She would pause, listening, tensing, then move forward again, her mind racing with strategies to stay unseen, undetected. Yet the exhaustion was becoming overwhelming. Her breathing grew labored, the weight of her pack pressing down on her shoulders like a burden that her injured body could barely endure. When she found water again, she crouched by the edge of a shallow stream, watching as her reflection flickered across its surface. Her face, streaked with dirt and exhaustion, seemed almost unrecognizable. This wasn't the confident warrior she had been just days before. She felt raw, stripped of the defenses her rank and training had instilled. Vulnerability wasn't something she was accustomed to. Gorn soldiers were trained to remain stoic, resilient, and unwavering, yet here she was, alone, injured, and for the first time, uncertain if she'd make it back alive. She raised her hand to her chest, feeling the steady, albeit weak, pulse beneath her scales. It was a small comfort, a reminder that she was still fighting, that life pulsed through her no matter how desperate her situation. Gulping the purified water, she felt a surge of renewed energy, albeit temporary, and she resumed her journey. The jungle's vastness stretched endlessly around her, and the realization settled in that she might never find an end to it. The thought gnawed at her mind, feeding a subtle dread she struggled to suppress. Cygnus wasn't just battling the physical challenges of the jungle. An internal conflict simmered beneath the surface, memories of her people's prejudices against humans. Her society had long viewed humans as unworthy, reckless, a lesser species prone to emotional impulsivity. Gorn values placed honor, discipline, and strength at the core of their society, and to them, humanity represented the antithesis of these traits. The stories of human recklessness and destructiveness were widespread in her culture, and she'd grown up hearing them like warnings whispered in the dark. And yet, stranded here with no allies, a seed of doubt had begun to sprout within her. How different could they truly be, especially if they faced dangers like this? The thought was unsettling, uncomfortable. She dismissed it, refocusing on her immediate surroundings, her survival instincts kicking back in. The jungle seemed to sense her distraction, and its silence grew heavier, pressing in around her like a physical force. Her steps slowed, and the familiar prickle returned at the back of her neck, a silent alarm that someone, was near. She froze, ears straining to catch even the slightest hint of movement. She could feel it, an unmistakable presence, watching her from the shadows. Her senses sharpened, and she resisted the urge to turn around, to confront whatever might be lurking just out of sight. The feeling was almost maddening, the awareness that she wasn't alone yet unable to pinpoint what, or who, it was. Each time she scanned the surroundings, she found nothing, only dense foliage and shadows too deep to see into. The jungle itself seemed complicit, hiding this phantom presence that haunted her steps. She tried to rationalize it. Perhaps an animal, perhaps nothing more than her mind playing tricks on her, heightened by isolation and exhaustion. But her instincts, trained and tested, refused to dismiss it so easily. Survival was a razor's edge in this place, and any mistake, any miscalculation, could be fatal. Despite her fears, the days stretched on, and she adapted. Her movements grew more fluid as she accepted the harsh rhythms of the jungle. She learned to move silently, to camouflage herself against the foliage, and to make use of her dwindling supplies sparingly. But the strain was taking its toll, both physically and mentally. The sense of being watched continued, an unspoken tension building with every passing hour. She couldn't shake the impression that this presence, whoever or whatever it was waiting, observing her every move. In moments of exhaustion, when her defenses were down, she found herself speaking softly, almost to herself, a habit she'd never developed before. In the silence, her own voice seemed strange, a reminder that she was still there, that she hadn't been swallowed by the jungle. Her words drifted, quiet admissions of frustration and despair. She'd cursed the jungle, cursed the crash, cursed the unknown figure lurking in the shadows. The air seemed to swallow her words, leaving them hanging in the humid stillness, a reminder of her isolation. Each time she stopped to rest, she felt the presence draw nearer, almost tangible, like a shadow she couldn't escape. It was close but never revealed itself, a silent reminder that her every movement, every breath, was under observation. And yet she grew accustomed to it, accepting its constant surveillance as an unavoidable part of her reality here. She still couldn't determine if it was friend or foe, if it would strike or if it was content merely to watch. But there was an understanding, an unspoken agreement, that they were bound together, her and this unseen observer, in a dance of survival. Her mind drifted back to her training, to the endless drills and harsh lessons. She was taught to depend on her own strength, to trust no one. And yet, here, in the unforgiving silence, she found herself hoping, against all reason, that the presence was an ally, that perhaps, in this strange, hostile place, she was not truly alone. The presence grew unmistakable, an unspoken tension pressing against her awareness, a weight that only grew heavier as she moved deeper into the jungle. Her steps faltered, her body demanded rest, yet the feeling of being watched compelled her to keep moving. But when a sharp pain shot through her leg, she stumbled, falling hard onto her side. As she tried to stand, her legs refused, weakened by days of strain, pain, and exhaustion. For the first time, she felt truly vulnerable, stuck in the middle of the wilderness with no energy left to fight. Just as she struggled to rise, a sound from the shadows drew her attention. She froze, instincts on high alert as she reached for her weapon, only to realize she no longer had the strength to defend herself. Emerging slowly, the figure stepped into the light, and her gaze met a pair of human eyes. She stared, heart racing, caught between distrust and disbelief. The human soldier's gaze held steady, unflinching, a calmness that seemed out of place in the wild chaos surrounding them. He didn't approach immediately, watching her closely, as if assessing her reaction. His hands were raised, empty, a universal gesture of peace, but she remained tense, still clutching her weapon as if it could offer any real protection. They stayed locked in silence, a standoff of sorts, each studying the other with a wary curiosity. He made no sudden moves, only shifting slightly to sit across from her, deliberately keeping a respectful distance. There was an understanding in his gaze, a recognition of her hesitation, and it was this careful respect that softened her defenses, however slightly. After a moment, he reached into his bag, moving slowly, pulling out a small canister. She tensed again, watching his every move, but he merely placed it on the ground between them before leaning back. It was a water canister. She understood the offer immediately, though part of her resisted accepting it, wary of any kindness from a human. Yet the parched feeling in her throat reminded her just how long it had been since her last drink. The tension was nearly unbearable as she reached out cautiously, eyes never leaving him, fingers brushing the canister before quickly pulling it back toward her. As she drank, he continued watching her, his expression neutral yet somehow gentle, as if understanding the depth of her mistrust. He waited, unmoving, showing no sign of impatience. Once she finished, she placed the canister back down, signaling an unspoken acceptance of his presence. Their silence was an agreement, fragile but understood. She didn't know what he wanted, but he hadn't tried to harm her, and that, for now, was enough. Moments passed before he offered her another item, a small, sealed packet. She examined it cautiously, inspecting the unfamiliar writing before tearing it open, finding dried food inside. The taste was foreign but not unpleasant, and she ate slowly, each bite both nourishing and strangely comforting. As she ate, he mimicked her actions, producing a similar packet for himself and eating alongside her, creating a shared rhythm that somehow lessened the tension. The act felt ritualistic, a subtle bridge between them, and as strange as it was, she felt a faint sense of solidarity. They were two survivors, sharing a simple meal in silence. The initial exchange over, they remained seated, an odd calm settling between them. Her mind buzzed with questions, but the language barrier held her back, every attempt at communication stifled by the lack of common words. She was used to the complex nuances of her own language, the layered meanings and precise tones, and her throat felt heavy with words she couldn't express. Yet he seemed to understand her frustration, his expression softening as he tapped his chest and spoke a single word. Connor. She realized he was giving her his name. The simplicity of the gesture caught her off guard. There was no demand, no expectation, only a willingness to bridge the gap between them. After a pause, she responded with her own name, her voice barely a whisper. The word felt foreign on her tongue, as though giving it to him somehow changed its meaning. He nodded, repeating her name softly, his accent twisting it slightly, yet there was something grounding in the sound. They were strangers, divided by species and conflict, but here, in the vast jungle, names seemed to level the space between them. The shared silence resumed, yet now it was marked by something different, a sense of tentative connection. She watched as he gestured toward her leg, his eyes filled with concern. She followed his gaze, noticing the swelling and bruising she had tried to ignore, the injury worsening as she pushed herself beyond her limits. He reached toward his pack, slowly retrieving a small medical kit, his actions deliberate, making sure she could see his intentions clearly. Her instinct was to refuse, to keep a boundary intact, but the throbbing pain and her weakened state left little room for pride. As he worked, she observed him closely. His movements were efficient yet careful, treating her wound with a precision that spoke of training and respect. He wrapped the wound expertly, securing it with bandages that were unfamiliar yet effective. His touch was gentle, respectful, never lingering beyond what was necessary. She felt a pang of unexpected gratitude, an emotion foreign to her in this context, stirring an unsettling warmth that conflicted with everything she had been taught about humans. With her leg tended to, the atmosphere shifted subtly. The silence between them grew comfortable, almost familiar, as if they had passed some unspoken test. She found herself studying him in a new light, taking in the details she had missed before. His clothing was worn, evidence of his own struggles to survive, and his face bore traces of exhaustion that mirrored her own. Here, stripped of rank, politics, and prejudice, he was just another being enduring hardship, much like herself. The day stretched on, the light filtering through the canopy casting a soft glow over their small clearing. They communicated in small gestures, basic signals that transcended words, finding ways to bridge the gaps in understanding. At one point, he pointed to a nearby plant, its leaves broad and veined with vibrant colors. He mimicked eating, then shook his head, a warning. She nodded, realizing he was helping her avoid dangers hidden in the unfamiliar flora. Slowly, a sense of mutual reliance emerged, unspoken but undeniable, each one learning to trust the other in small, cautious steps. As dusk began to fall, they prepared a small camp, working in silent tandem, sharing the tasks of gathering wood and setting up a shelter from the dense jungle. The act of cooperation felt strange yet natural, as if survival had stripped away the barriers between them, revealing the simple truth beneath: human or Gorn, survival was universal. As they settled in for the night, she glanced over at him, her thoughts a tangle of conflicting emotions. She had once viewed humans as reckless and impulsive, yet here, he was deliberate, measured, extending kindness without demand or ulterior motive. The jungle around them was dark and dangerous, but for the first time, she didn't feel truly alone. The jungle was alive with an intensity that heightened as night fell, every sound amplified by the silence between her and Connor. The air held a thick tension, as if something in the darkness was lying in wait. She kept her gaze fixed ahead, but her senses sharpened, attuned to even the faintest rustle of leaves, the softest brush of movement. Connor, too, was tense, his eyes scanning their surroundings with a focused intensity. Their fragile trust had held up through the day, but the weight of the night and the unknown shifted the air, making it feel charged, almost volatile. Without warning, a sudden crash erupted to their left, breaking the stillness. She barely had time to react before a creature lunged from the shadows, its eyes gleaming in the dim light, muscles rippling as it moved with a deadly grace. Its claws were like razor blades, its teeth bared in a snarl that echoed through the trees. Her instincts took over, her body moving before her mind could process the danger fully. She threw herself sideways, landing with a jolt, and rolled to her feet, reaching for her weapon. Her eyes darted to Connor, who had already drawn his own weapon, his posture defensive but focused. They moved in sync, each one mirroring the other's movements as if they had trained for this moment, though they had never spoken a word about combat or tactics. His gaze met hers briefly, a shared understanding passing between them, and then they focused on the creature before them, assessing it with practiced intensity. The beast snarled again, its body coiled, ready to strike, its powerful limbs tensing with each passing second. She recognized it as one of the jungle's apex predators, a hunter of lethal speed and strength, one that would require every ounce of their combined effort to bring down. Connor was the first to move, his stance fluid as he drew the creature's attention, his movements precise and calculated. She watched, momentarily struck by the finesse in his approach, and realized he was creating an opening for her. Without hesitation, she seized the moment, lunging forward and landing a strike that forced the creature back, just enough to give them a sliver of advantage. They worked in a rhythm that felt instinctive, each movement complementing the other, an unspoken language of survival and strategy. The creature was relentless, however, and each attempt they made to weaken it seemed to only fuel its aggression. As the fight raged, a sharp pain shot through her injured leg, nearly causing her to stumble. She forced herself to ignore it, drawing on reserves of strength she hadn't known were there, determined not to falter. Connor noticed, his gaze flicking to her with a brief flash of concern, but he didn't hesitate, stepping in to cover her when she needed it most. His movements were protective without being overbearing, his presence steady and reassuring. It was a partnership built in the heat of survival, each one instinctively trusting the other, despite the deep-seated mistrust that had once separated their species. In a final, decisive moment, they struck together, their combined strength enough to bring the creature down. Its body collapsed with a heavy thud, the jungle falling silent once more, as if the very air had been holding its breath. She stood, breathing heavily, feeling the ache in every muscle, yet a strange satisfaction filled her, a sense of triumph that was not hers alone but shared with him. They had survived together, against odds that would have likely defeated either of them alone. As the adrenaline faded, a quiet settled over them, a stillness that felt weighted with unspoken words. She met his gaze, seeing in his eyes a recognition that mirrored her own, a sense of respect, forged in the fires of mutual reliance and shared danger. She didn't need words to understand that they had crossed a boundary, that something fundamental had shifted between them. He moved closer, and for a moment she tensed, unsure of his intentions, but his gesture was simple. He extended his hand, offering her a silent acknowledgement of their bond, one that transcended language or history. Hesitantly she reached out, her clawed hand meeting his in a gesture that felt both strange and profoundly significant. Their differences fell away in that moment, leaving only the raw, unfiltered reality of survival. She could feel the warmth of his skin, the roughness of his calloused palm, and she knew that despite the barriers of species and culture, they were more alike than she had ever imagined. In the days that followed, they continued their journey together, each step building on the tentative foundation of trust that had been laid in that desperate fight. They shared the burdens of survival, dividing the tasks of finding food, securing shelter, and navigating the hostile terrain. He taught her things about the jungle that her instincts alone could not have deciphered, showing her which plants were safe, which paths led to water. She, in turn, shared her own knowledge, guiding them through the terrain with a precision he lacked, her familiarity with survival honed by years of training. Their silence became comfortable, a language in its own right, each glance, each gesture carrying meaning. She found herself watching him more closely, noticing the small quirks in his expression, the way he would pause to study the sky, as if lost in thought. His presence was steady, a constant in the ever-shifting landscape, and she felt a strange reassurance knowing he was there, an ally she hadn't known she needed. One evening, as they sat by a small fire, the flickering flames casting shadows around them, he gestured toward the stars visible through the canopy. She followed his gaze, understanding his unspoken question, wondering if anyone was looking for them, if they were remembered by those they had left behind. The thought was bittersweet, a reminder of the lives they had both led before fate had stranded them here. Yet, in that quiet moment beneath the stars, she felt an unexpected sense of peace, a quiet acceptance that, for now, this was their reality, and they were not truly alone. As the days turned to weeks, their journey neared its end, the edge of the jungle finally visible on the horizon. Relief mingled with an unexpected sadness, a reluctance to part ways that neither could fully acknowledge. She knew that once they returned to their respective worlds, the bond they had forged here would become a memory, a fragile echo that might fade with time. But as they reached the boundary and prepared to say their silent goodbyes, he placed something in her hand, a small token, a metal insignia bearing the symbol of his unit. She recognized it as a gesture of deep respect, an acknowledgement of their shared survival. She held the insignia tightly, her gaze meeting his one last time. There were no words, only a quiet understanding, a bond that transcended language and species, bound by the trials they had endured together. With a final nod, they turned and went their separate ways, each carrying the weight of that experience, forever changed.